1876, Montana Territory. Winter had not officially arrived, but the wind was already cutting across the valley like a sharpened blade. At the edge of an unfinished homestead stood a recently widowed immigrant woman named Marta. She had 6 children. The youngest was barely old enough to walk. The oldest was 12. She had no completed house, no husband, no close family within 1,000 miles. And in her pocket, she had $7. That was everything. $7, a handful of basic tools, 6 children depending on her, and approximately 6 weeks before temperatures in that part of the territory could fall low enough to kill an unprotected family in a single night. Most people hearing those facts would assume that this story ends badly. They would assume Marta and her children abandoned the claim. They would assume they begged their way into another family's cabin. Or perhaps they became part of the long, mostly forgotten list of settlers who never survived their first frontier winter. But that is not what happened. Marta survived. All 6 of her children survived. And the shelter she built with almost no money worked so well that nearby families began studying it, copying its most useful features, and adapting the design for themselves. She did not survive because someone suddenly arrived to rescue her. She survived because she stopped trying to build the kind of house people expected her to build. Instead, she asked a much more important question. What did 7 human beings actually need to remain alive through a Montana winter? The answer changed everything. This is a dramatized historical reconstruction inspired by the earth-sheltered homes, sod construction, fuel-saving techniques, and mutual aid practices used by 19th-century frontier families. Marta had crossed the Atlantic from Central Europe several years earlier with her husband. Like thousands of immigrants, they had been drawn west by promises of affordable land and the chance to build a life that belonged to them. The advertisements made the process sound almost simple. Travel west. Claim land, work hard, build a house, raise a family. What those advertisements rarely explained was what happened when the nearest established settlement was hours away. They did not explain what happened when tools broke, crops failed, illness arrived, or winter descended before a family had finished building. And they certainly did not explain Montana cold. The winters were not merely uncomfortable. They could be merciless. Wind stripped heat from badly sealed buildings. Snow buried roads and isolated homesteads. Firewood disappeared faster than frightened families expected. A weak roof could collapse under accumulated snow. A poorly vented fire could kill everyone inside without waking them. Marta's husband died during the autumn. His death left her with an unfinished homestead, almost no money, and 6 children who looked to her for answers she did not yet have. There was no time to grieve properly. Grief would have to exist beside labor. Every morning, she woke with the same unbearable truth. If she failed, her children would pay for it. She could not afford enough lumber for a conventional cabin. She could not hire experienced builders. She did not have enough time to cut, haul, split, and stack the enormous amount of firewood that a poorly insulated wooden structure would consume. She could not solve every problem in the conventional way. So she began by identifying the one problem that mattered most. Not comfort, not appearance, not respectability. Heat. Most people in Marta's position would have tried to build a small log cabin. That was what a frontier home was supposed to look like. 4 walls, a roof, a chimney, a door. But even a small cabin required timber. The logs had to be cut, stripped, moved, fitted, sealed, and stacked. The roof needed additional supports and covering. Every crack between the logs had to be filled before the wind found it. A cabin would have consumed time, labor, and materials that Marta did not possess. So she abandoned the idea. She did not ask how to build a house with $7. She asked how to keep 7 people warm with $7. That was a different problem. And different problems produce different answers. Marta decided to use the earth itself. A partially underground shelter would not need 4 fully exposed walls. The soil could block the wind. The earth could slow heat loss. A smaller enclosed space would require less fuel than a larger cabin, and every shovelful of soil removed from the ground could later be used again as insulation. She selected a location slightly above the creek's flood level. It was close enough to provide access to water, but high enough that seasonal runoff was less likely to enter the shelter. The position mattered. She studied the slope. She watched the direction of the wind. She examined where old snow had accumulated in shaded areas. She looked for signs of how water moved across the land after rain. Then she marked out a rectangle in the ground, approximately 12 feet by 14 feet. It was not much larger than a modern bedroom, but it did not need to be spacious. It needed to hold heat. The first week was almost entirely excavation. Marta and her older children dug from morning until the available light disappeared. The younger children carried loose soil in small containers. They moved stones. They gathered grass and branches. They completed whatever tasks their size and strength allowed. The family dug approximately 4 feet into the ground. The work was exhausting. The soil contained rocky layers. Their tools were basic. Their hands blistered, split, bled, and eventually hardened, and the temperature dropped a little more every night. They were racing an invisible line. Once the ground froze deeply, excavation would become dramatically more difficult. Every day spent hesitating was a day stolen from the shelter. The pit slowly deepened. At 4 feet, the surrounding earth began doing part of the work for them. Soil does not make an underground shelter warm by itself, but it changes how quickly warmth escapes. Instead of exposing every wall directly to freezing wind, the buried portions remained surrounded by a more stable environment. The earth became insulation. It also became protection from the wind, which could make already dangerous temperatures feel far colder. Marta piled the excavated soil along the sides most exposed to the prevailing weather. Those berms thickened the walls. They also encouraged wind to move around the structure instead of directly through it. Nothing was wasted. The soil removed to create the shelter became the material used to protect it. But the open pit was only the beginning. She still needed walls above ground level. She needed a roof strong enough to hold soil and snow. She needed ventilation. She needed an entrance that would not release all the heat every time someone opened the door. And she needed to accomplish all of it without spending money she could not replace. Marta began cutting the straightest pieces of timber available on the property. She did not have enough suitable wood to construct a complete cabin, but she had enough for roof beams and basic wall supports. The heaviest pieces were placed across the narrow dimension of the pit. This reduced the distance each beam had to span. Smaller branches were laid across the larger supports. Then came a deep layer of dry grass and straw. The dry plant material trapped pockets of air. Those air pockets helped slow the movement of heat. Above that went a layer of packed earth. The result was a heavy, low-sod roof that blended into the slope. The roof did not look impressive. It did not resemble the neat wooden cabins illustrated in settlement advertisements. But it did something more important. It worked. The structure sat low against the landscape. Wind passed over it instead of striking a tall wall. The earth above and around the shelter created thermal mass. The roof absorbed changes in temperature slowly. Once the interior became warm, it surrendered that warmth more slowly than a thin wooden roof would have. Marta also understood that water could destroy everything she had built. If rain penetrated the roof, the dry grass would become wet. Wet insulation would lose much of its value. The roof could grow heavier. The interior could become damp. So she shaped the surface carefully, giving it enough slope that rain and melting snow would move away from the entrance. She packed the upper soil firmly. She placed additional vegetation over vulnerable areas and inspected the roof repeatedly for low spots. Every flaw had to be discovered before winter discovered it for her. The entrance was another problem. A single door opening directly into the heated room would allow cold air to rush inside every time someone entered or left. With 6 children gathering water, tending animals, collecting wood, and completing daily chores, that could happen dozens of times. So Marta built a small entrance passage. It functioned as a simple vestibule. A person entered through the outer opening and closed it behind them. Only then did they open the inner door leading into the main shelter. Cold air entered the small buffer space instead of immediately flooding the living area. It was a simple addition, but over an entire winter, it could save a meaningful amount of firewood. Marta was not thinking about how the shelter looked. She was thinking about every place heat could escape. The family needed a fire. But an open fire inside a small underground room could create another deadly threat. Smoke and invisible gases could accumulate quickly. So Marta constructed a small stone hearth along one wall. She gathered stones from near the creek and selected pieces that could be fitted together securely. The chimney had to draw smoke upward and away from the interior. The root of the flue mattered. Its height mattered. The size of the opening mattered. A fire that burned poorly would waste fuel. A fire that smoked into the shelter could kill them. Marta tested the draft with small fires before trusting the hearth with a larger flame. She watched the smoke. She adjusted gaps. She sealed leaks with clay. She continued until the smoke moved in the direction she intended. Then she turned to the firewood. This was one of the most difficult parts of the entire plan. A conventional above-ground cabin could consume an enormous amount of fuel during a Montana winter. Marta did not have enough labor or time to prepare that amount of wood, but she had already changed the calculation. She was not heating a conventional cabin. She was heating a small, earth-sheltered room protected from the wind. Instead of producing more heat, she had focused first on losing less of it. That meant a smaller fire could maintain a survivable temperature. And that meant the amount of wood required was no longer impossible. Marta and the children cut whatever suitable wood they could manage. They collected deadfall. They trimmed usable limbs. They split larger pieces when their tools allowed it. They stacked the driest material closest to the shelter and protected it beneath the roof overhang. Marta kept track of the supply. She counted how much they gathered. As the nights grew colder, she measured how much they burned. She compared daily use against what remained. This was not casual optimism. It was active resource management under extreme pressure. A wrong estimate could mean running out of fuel before spring. The inside of the shelter was arranged with the same kind of discipline. 7 people would be living in a space roughly the size of a large modern bedroom. There was no room for wasted space. Sleeping areas were grouped together. Marta and the children slept close enough to benefit from shared body heat. During the coldest hours of the night, when the fire was allowed to burn low to conserve wood, 7 bodies beneath layered blankets contributed real warmth to the enclosed room. Shelves were cut into or built against the earthen walls. Food and tools were assigned specific locations. Wet clothing remained near the entrance rather than being carried throughout the shelter. The coolest interior areas were used for food storage. Nothing about the space was luxurious, but every part of it served a purpose. And now, before we reach the winter that would test everything Marta had built, take a moment to subscribe to What History Buried. This channel is about ordinary people facing impossible conditions and the specific decisions that allowed them to survive. Not vague legends, not empty inspiration. Real problems, practical solutions, and the forgotten ingenuity that history often leaves behind. Subscribe now, because the most dangerous part of Marta's story had not even begun. The shelter was nearly finished, but shelter alone could not feed 7 people. Marta still possessed only a small amount of money. $7 could not purchase an entire winter of food for a mother and 6 growing children. Once again, she looked at what she had instead of focusing only on what she lacked. She had labor. Her older children could work. She had practical knowledge. She could cook, mend clothing, clean, gather, preserve food, and help neighboring families prepare their own homes for winter. So the family traded work for supplies. Salted meat, dried beans, cornmeal, root vegetables, rendered fat, old blankets, small quantities of flour. Anything that could survive storage and provide calories through the coldest months had value. Some neighbors had more food than labor. Marta had more labor than food. The exchange allowed both sides to prepare. This was not charity in the way people often imagine it. It was frontier survival through mutual dependence. One family might own a strong team of horses. Another might know how to repair tools. Another might have extra grain. Another might have a healthy adult capable of cutting wood. A family that tried to survive entirely alone could fail even when the valley around them contained everything they needed. The challenge was turning separate resources into shared survival. Marta's shelter also attracted attention. At first, some neighbors considered it a sign of desperation. A hole in the ground did not resemble progress. It looked primitive, temporary. perhaps even shameful. But as the nights grew colder, people noticed something. Smoke rose steadily from Marta's chimney. The children remained active, the interior stayed dry, and the family consumed far less firewood than many people expected. What had appeared desperate began to look intelligent. Then the first serious storm arrived. The temperature fell quickly. Wind moved across the valley with enough force to drive snow through the cracks of poorly sealed cabins. Families added fuel to their fires and still felt cold air moving along their floors. Snow accumulated against walls and covered paths. Inside Marta's shelter, the storm sounded different. The wind moved above them. The earth absorbed much of the noise. The interior temperature dropped, but not as rapidly as it would have in an exposed wooden structure. Marta kept the fire small and steady. She did not waste wood, creating unnecessary heat. The objective was not to make the room hot. The objective was to keep it survivable. As snow collected across the sod roof and against the bermed walls, it created an additional layer of insulation. Snow can be deadly when it blocks doors, collapses roofs, or traps travelers. But undisturbed snow also contains enormous amounts of trapped air. That trapped air slows heat transfer. The deeper the snow became over the buried portions of Marta's shelter, the more protected those surfaces became from the extreme air outside. The weather grew worse, but in one important way, the shelter became more efficient. The family continued gathering water, tending the fire, preparing food, and rationing supplies. The vestibule reduced the rush of cold air every time someone entered. The low roof held warmth close to the occupants. The earth walls remained stable. The chimney continued drawing. The shelter passed its first real test, but survival was never a single test. It was hundreds of small tests repeated every day. Would the wood remain dry? Would the chimney stay clear? Would the roof support the snow? Would the youngest child become sick? Would the food last? Would someone become injured while gathering water? Would one unexpected emergency consume the small margin Marta had created? She responded by maintaining routines. The firewood stack was checked constantly. Snow was cleared from the entrance. The chimney opening was inspected. Food was measured. Children were assigned tasks based on their age and ability. The older children carried more responsibility. The younger children completed simpler work. Everyone contributed. Marta could not afford confusion. Routine reduced the number of decisions that had to be made during moments of stress. Then, a neighboring family faced a crisis. Their expected supplies failed to arrive before the roads became difficult. Their shelter was unfinished. Their food and firewood reserves were dangerously low. Remaining where they were could become a death sentence. Marta had barely enough room for her own family. Inviting more people inside would increase food use. It would create crowding. It would add moisture to the air. It would place more pressure on every resource she had spent weeks carefully calculating. But Marta also understood something else. People generate heat. More hands could carry water, cut wood, prepare food, and maintain the shelter. And a family turned away in those conditions might not survive the week. So she invited them inside. The shelter became crowded beyond anything that could reasonably be called comfortable. Sleeping arrangements had to be changed. A secondary platform was added. Supplies were reorganized. Every foot of space was used. But the people inside remained warm. The neighboring family experienced the shelter from within. They saw how the earth walls slowed heat loss. They saw how the vestibule protected the main room. They saw how the roof handled accumulated snow. They saw how little wood was required compared with an exposed cabin. Most importantly, they saw that the design was not merely a desperate shelter. It was a functioning system. The two families worked together through the winter. Food was rationed. Firewood was collected whenever weather allowed. Clothing was repaired rather than discarded. Heat was conserved. Illness was watched carefully. Nothing was taken for granted. The winter continued. Cold snaps arrived and remained for days. Snow covered the land. Travel became difficult and sometimes impossible. Other families struggled in structures that looked more respectable, but lost heat through walls, roofs, doors, and floors. Marta's home looked like part of the hillside. It was low, dark, crowded, but it stayed warm enough, and that was the only measurement that truly mattered. There were frightening nights when wind shook the entrance covering, Nights when the fire burned lower than anyone wanted. Nights when Marta lay awake listening to the breathing of her children and calculating how many days of wood remained. She was still grieving. That part of the story did not disappear because she was busy. She had lost her husband. She was carrying the physical and emotional weight of 6 children through one of the most dangerous situations imaginable. There were probably moments when she was afraid that she had calculated incorrectly. Moments when every sound from the roof felt like a warning. Moments when she wondered whether the next cold snap would be worse than the last. But fear did not remove the next necessary task. So she continued. She checked the chimney. She measured the wood. She prepared the food. She repaired clothing. She comforted frightened children. She woke the next morning and did it again. Survival was not one heroic decision. It was the repeated decision to do the next necessary thing. Eventually, the days began to lengthen. The cold did not disappear immediately. Winter rarely releases its grip all at once, but the sun remained above the horizon a little longer. Snow softened along exposed surfaces. Water began to move beneath the ice. Spring was approaching. When the season finally changed, Marta was still there. All 6 children were still alive. The neighboring family she had invited inside had also survived. The shelter had remained standing. The roof had held. The walls had stayed dry. The firewood had lasted. The design had succeeded. When the ground thawed, the neighboring family began building a shelter of their own. They incorporated the same low profile, the same use of earth, the same kind of protected entrance, the same attention to reducing heat loss before attempting to produce more heat. Other settlers asked questions. They wanted to know how thick the roof had been, how the beams were supported, how smoke was vented, how the entrance was arranged, how much firewood the family had actually used. Marta explained what she had done. Not every family copied the entire structure. Some incorporated only the vestibule. Others bermed the coldest wall of an existing cabin. Some added sod to roofs. Others lowered the profile of new buildings or used earth for storage rooms and emergency shelters. This is how practical knowledge often moved through isolated communities. Not through formal instruction, not through professionally printed plans. It moved through observation, conversation, experimentation. A neighbor saw something work. They copied the useful part. Then they adjusted it to fit their own land, tools, family, and climate. Marta's contribution was not a single perfect building copied exactly across the territory. It was a collection of proven ideas. Use the earth, reduce exposed surfaces. Block the wind, create an entrance buffer. Hold heat instead of endlessly producing more. Solve problems in the order they affect one another. Build for the environment that actually exists, not the environment you wish existed. The most important thing Marta did was not digging the pit. It was changing the way she defined the problem. A conventional frame said she needed a house. She did not have enough money, time, timber, or labor for a house. Had she remained trapped inside that definition, she might have spent her $7 trying to complete a structure that could never be finished before winter. Instead, she looked beneath the conventional answer. The real problem was thermal survival. Once the problem was defined accurately, entirely different solutions became possible. The shelter could be smaller. The earth could replace purchased insulation. The wind could be redirected rather than fought. Heat loss could be reduced before the fuel supply was calculated. Every decision changed the next decision. The shelter reduced the amount of required firewood. The reduced firewood requirement allowed the family to spend more time trading labor for food. The preserved food and organized space made it possible to shelter another family. The second family added labor and helped maintain the shared system. One solution created the conditions for the next. That may be the most useful lesson buried inside Marta's story. People facing a crisis often try to solve every problem simultaneously. They divide their attention between shelter, food, fuel, transportation, money, and fear. But some problems control the shape of every other problem. Marta identified the first problem correctly. She solved heat loss before calculating fuel. She created the shelter before planning life inside it. She built the system in the order that allowed each answer to support the next one. There is a temptation to describe people like Marta as superhuman, Doing so makes the story easier to admire from a distance, but it also makes the story less useful. Marta did not possess magical strength. She was grieving. She was exhausted. She was frightened. She had limited resources and imperfect information. What she possessed was the willingness to examine the problem honestly. She abandoned a familiar solution that no longer fit. She used what the landscape provided. She paid attention. She kept records. She adapted. She continued working, even when certainty was impossible. Those are not supernatural abilities. They are human abilities, but they become extraordinary when a person uses them under pressure. Marta stood at the edge of an unfinished Montana homestead with $7, 6 children, and winter coming toward her like a wall. She could not stop the winter. She could not replace her husband. She could not create money she did not have. She could not make the danger disappear. So she changed the equation. She built down instead of up. She held heat instead of wasting fuel. She turned soil into insulation. She turned labor into food. She turned neighbors into partners. She turned a place that looked like nothing into a shelter that kept people alive. And when spring finally arrived, Marta was still there. Her children were still there. The family she had taken in was still there. The structure had worked. The lesson had spread. And a woman who appeared to have almost nothing had created something valuable enough for other people to copy. That is what history often buries. Not only kings, wars, and famous inventions, it buries the quiet decisions made by ordinary people whose names rarely reached official records. People who solved problems because failure was not theoretical. People who studied the land because no expert was coming. People who built with what they had because what they wanted was unavailable. People like Marta. She had $7, 6 children, 6 weeks, and a winter capable of killing all of them. She dug in, literally and completely, and when spring came, she was still there. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to What History Buried. There are more forgotten stories like this one. Stories about ordinary people, impossible conditions, and the practical decisions that separated survival from disaster. Leave a comment telling me which part of Marta's strategy impressed you most. Was it the earth shelter, the protected entrance, the firewood calculations, or her decision to take in another family when she already had almost nothing? Like the video to help more people discover these buried stories. And subscribe, because the next person history forgot may have solved a problem the rest of us still need to understand.